All right. I'll be talking about how to op on the spot. I know that this is probably one of the most daunting parts of CP, but there's a lot of misconceptions around how the opposition process works, what it's like to debate a motion that you hear only in the PM speech, and how to adapt to that and actually succeed quite well. So, first things first, don't panic. If you draw op, it's actually quite a good thing. And the reason why is because, number one, CP judges tend to be lenient towards opposition teams. I think there's officially been a tally of roughly 60% win rates for opposition teams despite them not knowing the motion in advance. And that's simply because judges tend to be lenient towards them because they know that opposition teams don't have the advantage of bringing their own motions. So you're not right off the bat expected to deliver a speech with the quality and the depth of analysis that would be the case in a BP round where you have 15 minutes to prep, or if you were the Gov team bringing your own case. And ultimately, that does end up favoring op teams quite a bit, provided that they can do a bit of improvisation and being able to push out the important parts of the case early. So that's the first part. The second that I wanted to mention was that most government cases are actually quite poorly designed. They're very, very bad in a lot of situations, which is why opposition teams tend to be favored. They are either poorly prepared. So I know that most people just devise their cases on the bus ride to whatever tournament they're going to, assuming that things are not online, that is. A lot of motions that people are setting are too complicated or insular, as in you think that you have such strong knowledge of your case and that it's about this topic that you're super passionate about, but unfortunately, no one else, including the judges, knows about the topic, and that ends up playing often against government teams. And then the last thing here is a lot of gov teams drastically overestimate the quality of their cases. Sometimes it's simply because they didn't test them out with judges and an actual live practice round, or maybe because they think they have such a robust understanding of the motion, they've gone over it a million times that they're not prepared for whatever challenges you might bring to them. Just don't overestimate things. And if you're on opposition, just make sure to realize that most government cases aren't as strong as you might think they are. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about on this particular slide is that you actually know much more than you think you do in terms of debating skills, in terms of understanding the general principles and arguments and impacts of emotion. And these often can become you can come up with them pretty quickly in the debate. So there we go. Okay, what happens then when you first hear the motion? You're the leader of opposition, assuming, or even the DLO. Here are some tips that I think could be useful to you. First things first is to listen carefully. Don't rush. I know a lot of teams tend to scramble to try to determine what exactly the case should be. They feel like, oh my gosh, I only have 7 minutes. Maybe if it's a PMRE, I only have 6 minutes during the PM speech to prepare my case. And then they try to rush into their arguments without actually knowing what exactly they're supposed to be arguing for. One good piece of advice I like to give and that I use for myself and that has tended to work for me at least is to take the first minute of the PM speech to actually digest what the motion really means. And this is useful partly because PMs tend not to actually get into their arguments until probably a minute and a half into their speech, especially since they're introducing a motion to the judge and the panel and nobody else is familiar with it. So sometimes that comes with added description. So within that first minute, digest the motion, maybe talk to your partner a bit or like chat with them on whatever medium you have for online debates, and then just understand what's going on at first, knowing that actually you have much more time than you think you do. The second piece of advice I would give is to not be afraid to ask the government team some questions about the motion. This is perfectly reasonable. This is almost an extension of the principle of a point of clarification, where you're unsure of the model, you're allowed to ask clarifications to better understand what exactly the policy the Gov team might be implementing is. So if the model is unclear, especially on a this House would motion, you are perfectly allowed to ask points of clarification. And this is especially useful given the fact that there's a higher burden on government to be clear in the first place with their case. A second question I wanted to ask is the motion op choice? That's not the question that you ask government, but it's a question for you to ask yourself to kind of buy more time. If the motion is opposition choice, you have about a minute to decide whether you want to take one side or another of the debate. And in that process, you are allowed to do two things. First is to ask the other team whether there's certain parameters about the debate that you ought to know about, if there's a particular context in the round, etc. And the other is just discussing with your partner what side you get to pick. And usually you get a minute to do so. I always recommend that you use as much time as you reasonably can without interfering with the debate to get a better sense of what the round is by asking questions. And then the final thing is think of basic questions for yourself as a team. Some examples would include, what are the key examples from my side? Right? If I understand what case studies apply to my side of the debate, I have a good understanding of where I should situate my arguments and how I should develop them. Another question might be, is there an alternative that I should argue for? So for instance, in the debate that I just saw this morning, it was about whether humanity should leave Earth instead of trying to fix things in climate change. So is there an alternative I should argue for? For instance, mitigating climate change, which was an excellent alternative that the op team in my room ended up stumbling upon and devising their case around. Another question might be, what are the main impacts from my side? I usually advocate for an impact-driven approach to argumentation. If I know what the end goal of my argument is by isolating one or two key impacts, so for instance, saving more people or leading to more efficient outcomes or helping the most vulnerable in society, then I can immediately start to craft arguments around those impacts. And then the last question that you should probably ask yourself, among many, many others that I didn't include on this list, is the motion bogus? Right? Lots of motions are just poorly written, especially because a lot of the times they are people who don't have CA experience, who have never set a motion for themselves, who might be picking a motion from Hello Motions or using something, some concept that they saw in a TV show or in a news article, whatever the case may be. Sometimes the motions are really, really bad, and then you should be immediately skeptical of it. Another question you might ask is whether the motion is tight, and that's something that you might want to consider. As in, is the government setting too high of a burden on opposition to defend? Is the motion unrealistic for them to win on? And those are things that you can also start to base your case around. Okay, so this slide is basically a breakdown of the delegation of tasks for both speakers. And here the key is collaboration. You have limited time to develop your arguments, and that means that you need to have clear guidelines for what each speaker is to accomplish within that debate on opposition. And so here are some things that I think you should consider delegating between the first and second speakers. So for the first speakers, you might consider focusing on the stance and the burdens. That might just be something to guide the analysis, to be able to summarize your case in one or two sentences and distill your key impacts to their simplest forms. If you have given burdens, for instance, criteria for victory or things that you need to prove in order to win, it might be good to outline those at the beginning of your speech. Another feature of first speakers is to dispute the motion. If it is tight, if it's unrealistic, if it has too much of a high bar of knowledge for you to be able to participate on an even and fair playing field, then you, as the leader of opposition, have the responsibility to bring that up. You can't rely on the second speaker to dispute the motion later on. Obviously, if you've introduced a brief dispute of the motion, the DLO is also allowed to elaborate on it, but they can't be the first person to bring it up in the first place. Another thing you might do is obviously develop your arguments and also do some refutation. But, and here I wrote a specific thing that you should refute, which is the big picture contributions. If there are major mistakes in the models, if the argument and its key premises are faulty, those are things that you want to point out in the LO speech specifically. But when it comes down to the nitpicky details, the key weighings that the other team might have used that are not too important to the overall progression of the round, I would say actually probably avoid these because it's more important for you to develop the previous point, which is developing your own arguments, because that's mostly the key feature of the LO speech. So let's contrast that then to the second speakers, who have kind of a different set of rules. One thing would be to ask the questions about the motion. And that's specifically in the part where you're, let's say in an op choice motion, deciding what side of the motion you want, or doing POIs or asking points of clarification. I always recommend that the second speaker does that. Why? Simply because it buys time for the first speaker to be able to develop their case instead. And that just gives you a better case to flesh out right from the get-go. Another thing that you might do is assist the LO with responses. So let's say the LO is really focused on developing their 2 or 3 key constructive arguments, and they only have, at this point, 5.5 minutes to do so. Well, your job might be to provide those key contribution refutations instead, simply as a way to maximize your time. This is something that I personally do with my partner, Chris Pang, who is an excellent refuter. So I just tell him to tell me what to say to the judge. Another thing about second speakers that you're kind of expected to do is to fill the analytical gaps in the LO case. And the reason why is quite simple. The LO is not expected to have picture-perfect arguments with lots of depths and key mechanisms and impacts. That would be unrealistic. The judges know that, the DPM knows that, and you should know that as well. But with that understanding, you should still be able to fill in those analytical gaps to effectively clean up the arguments and develop them further. And so what that requires of you as a second speaker, so as the DLO, is to listen very carefully to what your partner is saying and possibly what your partner is missing. And so that when they sit down, you know exactly what else you have to fill in their stead. And then the last thing I wanted to mention for second speakers is quite simple. Just destroy Gov. Go full offensive. Attack the motion. Attack the arguments. Fill in those gaps that your LO speaker didn't bring up, perhaps in terms of responses that they didn't have the time to get to because they were pushing out the case. But as the DLO, you're kind of overpowered here because you've had a lower burden of proof for all of your arguments, given that you're on opposition, and you've gotten the additional time of 3 total speeches to develop a concrete case with which to dismantle the government team. So destroying Gov is really, really important. Also, when you consider the fact that there's 10 minutes in a row where opposition speakers speak, be it with a 10-minute LO or with a 10-minute DLO or with a 7-minute DLO and a 3-minute LOR, you should really focus on being offensive as possible and making that PMR, that Prime Minister rebuttal, the last summary speech of the round, really difficult for Gov to surmount. Okay, moving on. Crafting arguments. How do you build a case in 6 minutes or less? A few things to keep in mind here. First is that details are obviously important. No one will state otherwise. But if you are the LO, you don't need to sweat them too much. There is a lower expectation of you when you build your case. What is expected of you, however, is to push out the main ideas. Let's say there's a key actor in the motion from whose perspective you need to argue. It would be really problematic if you didn't address that key actor perspective, or there was a key impact that you needed to develop, or a set of mechanisms that were required to make your arguments plausible. Make sure to address these as much as possible within the LO speech. And the reason being is that you don't want to be accused of doing what's called a DLO dump. A DLO dump basically refers to the idea that the deputy leader of opposition is the one who advances the entire case. They were the ones to bring up all the key important arguments that were missing in the LO speech. So while it is okay for the DLO to fill in those analytical gaps, it's not okay for them to be the first to introduce the key concepts and arguments and actors and mechanisms that were supposed to come up in the LO speech. And the reason is simple. The PMR doesn't have adequate time to refute it, and the judge can't give you full credit from bringing those ideas up so late in the round, because it wouldn't be fair to Gov to have to respond to a whole new case in a 3 or 4 minute PMR. Now, crafting arguments in 6 minutes is hard, I'll admit. But if you're stuck, an easy way to approach this is to simply argue the opposite of the government case. Let's say they make an argument for why their alternative in the debate, their solution to a given problem, like let's say climate change, was really plausible. Well, you might make an argument that just says, here's why their solution is actually really implausible. So flipping it around and building a whole constructive case around that helps you simultaneously build an argument required for your opposition case as a whole, and also helps you implicitly respond to the government team as well. Another thing, and just a key piece of guideline to follow, is to focus on proving 2 or 3 key impacts for your side. Why? It's because you're not expected to go full analytical and have like 8 mechanisms. So focus on the things that you realistically can accomplish with 6 minutes of prep and do those few things really, really well. Being simple and concise is often the key to winning on opposition. Because again, the judges don't expect you to have a fully fleshed out case. But if you have just enough of well crafted, but perhaps limited analysis, the judge already has a lot of doubt casted onto them. Why is it that a team on opposition with zero prep had 2 ideas, but those ideas were so well developed that the other side was already starting to crumble? If you're able to do that, often you're more likely to be successful. Less is sometimes more. And then finally, don't be afraid to improvise. It's inevitable. You're supposed to do it basically in any debate round you'll ever have with stuff like POIs, or just maybe 15 minutes is not enough to craft a fully fleshed out case. But improvisation is key here. And actually, you'll realize that you know much more about your arguments than what is written on a sheet of paper, which is why I think that outlines are perhaps more important than various mechanisms themselves. Because if I can have on my sheet of paper a list of questions, why is my argument likely? Why is my impact so significant? How does this compare to the opposition's mechanisms? I can just ask these questions on my sheet of paper, say them out loud, and force myself to answer on the spot. And often I'll come up with 2 or 3 reasons just like that. And it's really easy because you just force yourself to do so, and it shouldn't take too long. So outlines are often more than sufficient towards developing a proper leader of opposition case. So if you see a sheet of paper that looks like the one that SpongeBob is holding in the meme on the right, you are okay. It is fine. Improv. You'll get better at it the more you do it. And honestly, whatever you improvise is better than just not saying things at all and not filling your time. General strategies. I think this is the last slide. Number 1, cast some doubt on the motion and the gov case as a whole. The reason why is because government is, perhaps unfairly sometimes, expected to really know their motion through and through, to have tested it with a judge in the past, to anticipate the responses from the other side, and to craft a case that is fair and equitable to all teams in the round. And sometimes, just because they're unprepared or they overestimate their case, they just fail to do so. So casting doubt on the motion itself is a useful strategy that's almost argumentative in and of itself. Is the motion tight? That is something that's going to reflect poorly not on you as a team, but on the other side, because it was their responsibility to come up with a good motion. Are the government's characterizations uncharitable? Let's say that they have a motion with a really, really long info slide that they take for given, but that might not actually be the case in real life. Well, make sure to dispute that. And if their characterizations are uncharitable, in some ways, that might actually mean that the motion is in and of itself tight. Finally, do their arguments satisfy their burdens? Lots of teams will have motions that attempt to resolve some sort of problem, but are not at all the appropriate solution to doing so. So then dispute the motion. You might acknowledge that all of the problems that they point out are perfectly legitimate, but that the motion itself is not the appropriate way to resolving those issues. That would be something useful to bring up as well. Casting doubt on the motion is absolutely a valid strategy. You do not need to only cast doubt on the motion. In fact, it is discouraged of you to do so for an elongated period of time. If I were the LO, I would not dedicate more than, let's say, 1.5 minutes disputing the motion, maybe even less. The reason being is that if it's tight and you can articulate that clearly, the judge will more than likely be able to buy it. And then by refuting the motion or disputing the arguments or bringing up a valid case in spite of the fact that it might be tight, you show yourself as a team to be even stronger, to be able to argue against a really tight motion effectively. And if in the event that the tight call is rejected by the judge, or that a clever gov team has already anticipated your tight call and has responses prepared to it, that's also something that you can absolutely do. So just be careful not to rely on the tight call or casting down on the motion too much, but use that as a strategy effectively if you wish. Second general strategy to mention here is to be simple, concise, and clear. Sometimes teams are going to be incoherent because they have to develop something on the spot and they feel unprepared. That is fine. Less is more. Focus on what you can manage in the spot And if you show yourself to be simple and clear, the judge, who is also, by the way, completely new to the motion, is more likely to sympathize with you because you were able to distill something complicated that they also might not be familiar with, that they have to grapple with and adjudicate on the spot. So if you can boil it down for them, they're more likely to be extra sympathetic towards you as a team. And also, if you're really incoherent and the DLO fixes up all your problems and cleans things up a bit too much, you might be accused of a DLO dump. So it's really important to be clear, particularly in the first speech. And lastly, immerse yourself in the debate. Far too often, teams, and I get it, this third comment might be somewhat in contradiction with the first one, but given the caveat of don't cast doubt on the motion too much, or at least don't make that the focal point of your case, I can still proceed with this last point. Immerse yourself in the debate. There are going to be really interesting and cool cases that you might not have encountered previously and that you should be willing to jump into. Oftentimes, the most effective opposition teams are the ones that can best understand the motion in the given moment and just take it on in stride, to be positive about the way they do so, and to really get into what it is that the Gov team intended. This is effective for a number of reasons. A, it just makes the debate more fun and it makes you look like less of a salty, angry person if you're not just bickering about the motion for a whole 7 minutes. No one likes to see that. Not your Gov team, not your DLO, I can assure you, and certainly not the judge. Also, it means you're more likely to understand the debate and get to the key arguments. And it's just a much more pleasurable experience for both teams. So definitely do immerse yourselves in the debate. And then the last pieces of advice I'll give you is just win. Or at the very least, have fun losing. Because CP shouldn't come with all the pressure and stress that BP does. Certainly it is meant to be competitive, as is any sort of competitive debate. But you're here to debate fun motions. Improvisation is great because you feel less personal responsibility towards bringing up your own case. And so just enjoy it. Have a fun time. That's what we're here to do in the first place. So